One of the things that we know, I think, instinctively from birth is a sense of fairness and what is equitable to me. Um, I remember before we had moved to Ukraine, so Benjamin was less than a year old. I remember sitting in my chair, and Katie was. We were having coffee one night, and um, we Benjamin sensed that we had something that he didn't, and he was very interested in what was in our cups. So Katie got a decoy coffee cup, and hey, here's your cup. Now he didn't see what was in our cups, but he couldn't. He could barely crawl, but he would scoot across trying to get her cup, and then he'd scoot over to me trying to get my cup, and we'd offer him the decoy cup, and he'd look at it, and he was not interested at all. He knew that there was something instinctively inside of him knew that what was in the lack of anything in his cup made him different. We had something in ours, and he recognized that it wasn't fair, and he just kind of tried to climb up and grab the coffee cup because he wanted it. Well, along comes kids, right? And so um, now you have the sense of equity between children. This toy, that toy, this cookie, that cookie. Well, I don't get that. We have, if we have cookies and there's one cookie left over, they want us to divide the cookie in four pieces. Right? That's equity. They have that sense. I'm being treated less fairly than everybody else. And if we say no, well, the next day I need to have an extra cookie because I didn't have one yesterday, and that person did. And what ends up happening is as parents we kind of buy into this a little bit, and maybe it's not all wrong. We don't want the same person to kind of go without all the time. That would leave a feeling of resentment. Um, but we kind of, instead of actually having equality, which isn't always possible actually, because it's not possible to divide up the cookies all the time the right way and eat perfectly even. What we end up doing is having a well managed sense of partiality. In other words, we kind of juggle back and forth between who gets the privilege and who doesn't. And so now we got to make up for this over here. Um, and sometimes I say no. Sometimes as a dad, I'm like, no, you're not getting an extra cookie today because that person got it. You're just so our kids, in fact, are used to the phrase that I say whenever this comes up because they get this highly, honed sense of justice. And so they've heard me say, when I said no, they'll hear me say, you know what? When you go to college, you have my permission on your first day to make up for all the cookies that you missed. I, you can just get like 4 boxes of Oreos and just go through them, and then you will eat up and have fairness for all the cookies you missed. And that's my way of saying I can't always make everything perfectly fair. We want to, but what we do when we establish that that's the way justice goes is we're establishing that we go back and forth to try to make equality, and that's not really equality. As I said, that's just managed partiality. Um, this occurs. A good example of this occurs in our New Testament, actually. Um, that's the first problem in the history of the church is justice. There's a group of widows that are being taken care of. So there was a group of women that didn't have the ability to support themselves and or make, you know, provide for themselves, even their own food. And so the church decided we're going to take care of them. And so what happens is now there's two groups of women in these. Some of them were the Jewish natives. They were They were from Jerusalem or the surrounding area. And then there's what's called the Grecian widows. Now, these aren't Greeks per se. They're Jewish, but they might be from Alexandria. They might be maybe half bred. I don't know exactly, but they might have been from Athens or whatever. They're called Grecians. They might be proselytes. Maybe they were Gentiles that had converted to Judaism. It's not exactly clear who they were, but they certainly weren't purebreds. They were a little bit different, and they were getting less of the rations, if you will. They were getting treated inferior, and so the answer to this, the apostles address it, and they appoint 7 men to oversee and make sure that things are equal. And what's interesting is how they don't approach this. And they don't do what a lot of people in our society right now, and I mean not just society, I'm talking about the church, are getting involved in this well-managed sense of partiality. They don't engage in that. They don't say, listen, to you native Jews, you've been privileged. And so what we're going to do is we're now going to emphasize the suffering of the Grecian Jews. And so you're going to go without, and we're not going to really talk about your need in this situation. We're going to talk about their need because their need is superior because of the way they've been treated in the past. That's not the solution. That would have only created more disunity. They already have plenty of disunity to go around. The apostles aren't going to create more disunity. And so they don't de-emphasize or overemphasize the suffering of one group, even if the suffering of one group was greater, which it was. Skip forward a little bit, because this comes up again in a different way. Paul writes Romans, and now he's not dealing with different groups of Jews, but now the church is opened up to the Gentiles. And he writes Romans about this topic. In fact, it was such a problem that almost every book of our New Testament, and certainly of the Apostle Paul, deals with this to some extent or another. This problem between the Jews and the Gentiles. And he writes in Romans that it goes back and forth between the Jews and the Gentiles, right? And he gets to chapter 11, and he's talking about how the Jews had been privileged to be children of Abraham, that by design they had been privileged for a couple thousand years. And he says, but you know what? I've broken them off, and he's talking about the unbelieving ones, so that the Gentiles could be grafted in. Right? And he's going back and forth. You now are in the same group. And this is in Ephesians, and a lot of places talk about this. But he then turns to the Gentiles, and he has some advice for them. He says, now, don't start thinking more highly of yourself. Just because I've grafted you in doesn't delegitimize the importance of the Jew. In numerous places in Romans, Paul talks about hoping for the salvation of that group that was broken off. In other words, Paul is not overemphasizing the suffering of the Gentile simply because they had been underprivileged for thousands of years. Unity is not going to be gained by saying, here's a group that suffered in the past. We have to emphasize their suffering. There's another thing that's going on in our society, and it kind of juxtaposes with this, and it's called multiple things. It's called intersectionality, critical theory. It's got a lot of different phrases. But what it really boils down to is that we put people in groups, and we look at them as groups. And then that makes it easy. So if you're in this category that I've decided to categorize you at, all I have to do is find out what, I have all these categories, and all I have to do is find the one where you go, drop you in, and that's how I approach you. Because you're in this category, I look at you this way. And so Paul's really not even into categorization. There's neither Jew nor Gentile. Uh, there's neither male or female. There's not rich or poor, slave or free. These categorizations, he's not into them. We have to be able to relate to people on an individual basis. As long as we're looking at the suffering of a group, and this is your skin color, so you've had this suffering. Well, that's not necessarily true. Or you have this, so I don't need to worry about your position because you're this, so your suffering doesn't matter. We delegitimize the experience of individuals, and that makes it difficult for us to relate to people, and it will make it difficult for us to extend the gospel to them. If they don't see that the gospel, well, you're not really that important. We have to get rid of some of these are secular ideas that are in our society, and they're being brought very subtly into the church, and they're given kind of a skin of Scripture, but they're not the way the apostles approached things, as I've shown you. Paul didn't, the first apostles didn't, Jesus didn't. This emphasis of one group over another is not going to promote unity within the church, and it is not going to offer anything superior to those who are outside of the church. They already have this philosophy. They already have these methods of dealing and trying to gain unity. If we are a part of it, we're not going to have anything different to offer.